Hello, everyone. Good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson. And this week, we are back in the Gospel of Luke, chapters 22 and on into portions of 23. And we're looking at the moment of Jesus's trial, both before the Sanhedrin and, of course, before Pilate. And a piece of it actually shows him before Herod, although I don't think we're reading that in the particular text that we have in front of us today. But we're going to read this. And then as we do, of course, we'll pray and then we'll dig in a little deeper. So join me here in Luke 22, beginning in verse 20 or 66. When daylight came, the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the scribes, convened and brought him, that being Jesus, before their Sanhedrin. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." But he said to them, "If I do tell you, you will not believe me. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" And he said to them, "You say that I am. Why do we need any more testimony?" They said, "Since we've heard it ourselves from his mouth." Then their whole assembly rose up and brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, opposing payment of taxes to Caesar and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Pilate then told the chief priests and the crowds, "I found no grounds for charging this man." But they kept insisting, "He stirs up the people, teaching them throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he started, even to here." Then moving further into chapter 23, Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people and said to them, "You have brought me this man as one who misleads the people. But in fact, after examining him in your presence, I have found no grounds to charge this man with those things that you accuse him of. Neither has Herod, because he sent him back to us. Clearly, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will have him whipped and then release him." Then they all cried out together, "Take this man away. Release Barabbas to us." He had been thrown into prison for a rebellion that had taken place in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What has this man done wrong? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him whipped and then release him." But they kept up the pressure, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified, and their voices won out. So Pilate decided to grant their demand and release the one they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for rebellion and murder. But he handed Jesus over to their will. Pray with me. Jesus, our King, Lord, as we read these moments, while they are slightly different and vary from one gospel account to the other, while we may not know exactly the order or sequence in which you said these words, one thing is for sure: they are penetrating, and they are deep, and they are filled with lots of meaning. Lord, I pray that we would shake off the sense of familiarity that we have with these words, and instead, would you help us to connect to deeper, more rooted biblical themes that we've discussed in previous lessons and the months and years that we've been diving deeper into Scripture to better understand what you intend to communicate to us through your word, and ultimately how it's supposed to shape us and what we're to do with it. So, Lord, I just pray, may we not be contemptuous, but instead humble, contrite in heart, willing to listen and learn for your glory's sake. We ask these things in your name. Amen. So in looking at this account in any of the Gospels, I think the particular standpoint that I intend to ground you in through this lesson is available in all of them to see. And so that was part of the approach that I wanted to take, although, of course, it is certainly worth the study as to understand why Luke's account is a little bit different. And we should, like detectives, take and forensically analyze Luke's account the same way we would Mark's, Matthew's, and John's, and see the subtle variations in the details. But don't isolate those details away from what's really going on in that particular gospel's perspective, as goes the uniqueness of the writer and what it is that he is wanting us to capture, as goes the full breadth of Jesus's story from start to finish in that particular gospel. And so with that, there are certain things that Luke has already laid down for us earlier in the gospel that he would want us to see and pay attention to. But of course, with that, I don't think I'll have the time to really go into it. So I hope that as I encourage you to try to see those things, that you would take some of the tools that I've tried to help impart to you in previous lessons and then use them here for the sake of learning a little bit more from this lesson than what I can share with you in the limited time that we have. That being said, what I think perhaps might be a little bit more important, because it's a transcendent theme in Scripture and because it actually pairs very well with the lessons that we've already looked at in just the recent weeks. And that is the Day of Atonement, but in the crucifixion. Now, to make sure that we understand what's actually going on circumstantially at the time of Jesus's passion. As you've heard me say before many times, the Bible makes it very clear that he is being crucified on Passover weekend. Passover weekend, of course, happens during the mid-month of the first month. Around the 14th day, those lambs that have been chosen on the 10th day are going to be slaughtered. And so this happens to coincide right with the 14th day of the 7th month. Well, it's on the 10th day. I'm sorry, let me backtrack. On the 14th day of the first month. It happens that on the 10th day of the 7th month, the Day of Atonement actually transpires. So there are roughly 6 months of time that are separating these two particular moments on the liturgical calendar. So because of that, obviously Jesus was not meant to die twice, but there are significant themes going on within both of those days that are meant to be wrapped up in the Passion narrative. I don't think it's important for us to see that Jesus was crucified on the Passover as if to isolate that one as being more important per se. But because of the fact that symbolism is a bit more potent, on the other hand, perhaps that's the reason why God in his foreknowledge chose to have Jesus crucified that weekend versus any other weekend. And then again, I'm not very positive as to whether or not pilgrimages were made in first century AD time frame by Jews to the area of Judea and Jerusalem in order to observe the Day of Atonement. In fact, there's no real record inside the New Testament construct itself as to whether or not the Day of Atonement was even being celebrated. I'm not suggesting that it's not. All I am saying is that from the simple record of the New Testament, we have no mention of it. So clearly what seems to be in some respects a bit more of an important liturgical day, the Passover, as it's mentioned throughout the gospel record, especially John's more frequently there than the others. Certainly it's mentioned hand over foot more so than the Day of Atonement, which again, outside of the book of Hebrews or that tractate of Hebrews, the New Testament is virtually silent on. So with respect to that, I want to challenge our minds to see these 2 days that are separated by nearly 6 months of time as being telescoped on top of one another. When I say telescope, I hope you understand I'm not talking about a giant telescope that is used to see the stars in the night sky, because that doesn't move except as one entire piece. I mean more or less a telescope that perhaps a ship captain might use to see things further out in the water. And of course, it collapses on top of itself when you want to shrink it down. And so with that, these things are telescoping or collapsing on top of themselves, something of a kaleidoscope effect, in which both themes are seen as operative simultaneously. So with that in mind, we're going to discuss a little bit of the Day of Atonement in the crucifixion, beginning first by actually looking at the Day of Atonement in just a little bit more detail, perhaps, than we have in recent weeks, as we talked about this, I think it was last week, discussing some of the passages from Hebrews. So in Leviticus chapter 16, the actual passage that covers the Day of Atonement, starting in verse 5, without going through the entire passage or chapter and isolating every single detail, just really looking at the nuts and bolts of it. Aaron, or he, as is in verse 5 here, and of course this would also be any high priest who takes up the mantle after Aaron has passed away. He is to take from the Israelite community 2 male goats for a sin offering. But now I would, from this moment, refer you to the first subtitle here, Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. 2 male goats are chosen for chatah, or purification offerings. And what's a little strange about this is the dual nature of the word itself, where it oftentimes in English translations, this Hebrew word kata is translated as sin, but in other instances is also translated as purification. But in reality, the word means both. The actual offering is meant to purify for sin that is committed. Okay. So 2 male goats for a sin offering or purification offering, and a ram for a burnt offering, which of course does not have a purifying effect in quite the same way that the sin offering is meant to. And then we read just but 2 verses later, next he will take 2 goats and place them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So what we understand here is that 2 particular goats are going to be isolated for a unique event, and it's only meant to happen just one particular day within the entire calendar year for Israel. Now, both of these goats are chosen with equal criteria in place, that one of them is not meant to be lame and the other one is supposed to be the prize goat. Both of them have to be able to potentially be the one who is going to bear the mantle of being the sacrificial goat, whereas the other one is going to be the one sent off into the wilderness. The decision cannot be made prior to them casting the lots as to which goat is going to bear which mantle. And so because of that, they both have to be equally fit. Okay, so at any given moment, either of these goats are potentially the sin offering, even though one is actually going to be the goat that's slaughtered, while the other one will not be the sin offering. It will be sent off instead to Azazel. So our second subheading here, lots are cast to determine which will be slaughtered and which will be sent to Azazel. Most of our English translations will say something like a wilderness place or a desolate place, or in this case, in the CSB, it will say here uninhabitable place. So it's meant to be a place where no one is living. Reading a little bit more into the context of verses 8 through 10, after Aaron casts lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other for an uninhabitable place, or again, Azazel, that's what this phrase means, just to make sure we're connecting them. He is to present the goat chosen by lot for the Lord and sacrifice it as a sin offering. But the goat chosen by lot for an uninhabitable place is to be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement with it by sending it into the wilderness for an uninhabitable place. Now, it's interesting because the actual word kippur here from the Hebrew word kafar is actually connected here to this word atonement, because that's what we're understanding is going on here. But a lot of times when we think of the concept of atonement in the Old Testament, our minds have a tendency to go to animals being sacrificed, blood spilled. And by virtue of that, because blood is spilled, then atonement happens through the vicarious sacrifice, the animal in the place of the human being, who of course is the guilty, sinful party, and the animal taking their place. But when we actually start to break down what's going on in these different sequences with respect to a burnt offering or a sin offering or a guilt offering and whatnot, and the functionality of how each of those animals are supposed to actually atone for sin, then different angles actually start to fall into place that are not necessarily what we're witnessing or thinking about when we go through the basic concept of atonement, which I think what's really happening is that we're just taking the more simplistic picture of Jesus willfully taking the place of any and every sinner who will come by faith. And by virtue of that, their sin is transmitted to him or imputed to him, while his righteousness is then imputed to that person by faith. And then, of course, his blood is shed so that that guilty sinners does not have to be. So it's more simplified, that his blood is shed, and by virtue of his shed blood, atonement happens. And that's true. However, when we look back at the Old Testament, especially when we're looking at the concept here of the Day of Atonement, something slightly different arises, because we actually see 2 different things happening with respect to these 2 goats. Now, granted, both goats, as I said, have to meet the same basic criteria. One goat cannot be less favorable than the other, because certainly the one who is presenting the goats cannot know which way the lot will fall, nor are they supposed to manipulate it. So by virtue of that, either of these goats are going to be the sin offering that's actually sacrificed, while the other goat is sent out into the wilderness. But notice this, it's the goat that's alive that's sent out into the wilderness, right? Not the goat who was slain. So atonement is not actually made for the people's sins by virtue of shed blood. Atonement is made by a living animal sent off into the wilderness. Now, atonement is made with the shed blood of the actual sin offering that comes from the one chosen by Lot for the Lord. But that atonement is for a totally different purpose. As we talked about last week, that atonement is actually for the holy place. It's to cleanse it from the sins and the iniquities of the people as they have continued to mount up. And we'll actually touch on that again here in just a second. So just wanted to create that distinction in your mind so you have that readily available moving forward. We go to verse 11 of chapter 16. So when Aaron presents the bull for his sin offering and he makes atonement for himself and his household, he will slaughter the bull for his sin offering. But now it's important for us to take this back to the host text from which it actually comes from. And first of all, we need to be reminded in Exodus chapter 28, verse 38, that as the descriptions of Aaron's garments, each piece and its uniqueness and what it's going to be used for and so forth, we have one particular piece that has special attention called to it. And that is a pure gold medallion that will be on Aaron's forehead, really over the turban crown that he wears, so that Aaron may bear the guilt connected with the holy offerings that the Israelites consecrate as their holy gifts. So notice this. When it says holy offerings, we have to understand the context that's about to arise for us that's going to describe this. It's not been made clear yet, but it will be once we get to the book of Leviticus. And we'll understand that every offering that's made is holy. Certain offerings, namely the burnt offering, is so holy that only the Lord gets that. Nobody, not even priests, get to partake of it. Then all the rest of the food offerings are meant to be seen as holy offerings. Grain offering, most holy offering, and that those offerings, as far as particular pieces, are meant either for the Lord, as goes the fat that covers the entrails of the animal, the kidneys and so forth. And then, of course, the breast and shoulder are meant for the priests. And then the rest of the meat can be eaten by the offerer and anyone else they particularly want to share with, if it's a type of offering that can be utilized for that purpose. But then bread offering, as goes grain offerings, that's meant for the Lord. But after the Lord gets his memorial portion, the rest of it's meant for the priests. And it has to be eaten because it is the most holy offerings. And so by virtue of that, that only certain people who bear the actual credentials to share in those sacrifices can. And other portions are meant for the people, and they are not necessarily considered as holy as those other gift offerings. So the idea is that when it comes to the phrase holy offerings here, what we're talking about are those offerings brought to the tent and offered on the altar of burnt offering. And then, of course, with that, certain offerings are going to mean certain things. And we'll actually see that in the context of Leviticus chapter 4. But let me finish out this verse in Exodus 28. It is always to be on his forehead. That, of course, is the pure gold medallion, so that they might find acceptance with the Lord. Now, notice this. When we get to Leviticus chapter 1, we will understand that part of the reason why the offerer is to use an animal in every context when offerings are going to be made, with the exception of a few, as goes those who are poor, or maybe it's a special type of offering that doesn't require meat. But if it is an offering that requires an animal, then of course the offerer has to lay their hand on the head of the particular animal that's going to be given in its place, in their place. And by virtue of that, as it says in chapter 1, they will find acceptance with the Lord. But in this particular context, the people aren't finding acceptance with the Lord merely through an animal. They're also finding acceptance with the Lord through their sin bearer. And I would go as far as to say their righteous sin bearer, not because the high priest is sinless. Righteousness does not accord sinlessness, not in the strict biblical context. What it does mean is a person who is living rightly with God and with man. And so if the high priest is exercising his office faithfully, it can be said of him that he is righteous. By virtue of that, if he is honoring the Lord faithfully through the exercise of his office, and of course living with man so as not to defraud them, as some of his descendants will, as goes Aaron in this case, then by virtue of that, he can rightly bear the people's sins. And he does, not just on this gold medallion. The gold medallion in its description is what matters here. And the fact is that it says something akin to holiness unto the Lord. So the high priest is set aside as this holy, righteous sin bearer, already as a foreshadowing type of what Jesus will be, as, of course, the righteous, innocent, holy, sin-bearing substitute. So Aaron, in a sense, is actually bearing their sins before the Lord as he is ministering in sacred space. But that creates the context for the need of the Day of Atonement. If we understand the Day of Atonement is first and foremost geared toward actually cleansing the sacred space of the tabernacle complex of all of these people's sins and iniquities that were, if you remember last week's lesson, committed unintentionally. Sins of high-handedness are dealt with differently. We're not going to rehash that. But this creates the need for why these sin offerings are going to be offered in the first place. But of course, Aaron is not offering sin offerings every day. We talked about that also last week with respect to what the writer of Hebrews had to say and what the real concept behind offerings every day was particularly supposed to mean, or at least what we can, I think, reasonably and rationally infer it to mean, because nowhere in the Old Testament is there any mention of a need for the priests offering sin offerings every day. And then again, sin offerings themselves are not meant to atone for all sin, only unintentional sins. And that, of course, would be brought periodically, not every single day, because that's not introduced to us as a concept in the construct of Leviticus chapter 4, which is the actual chapter that outlines sin offerings more completely. So with that, we get into Leviticus 4 to help us better understand what's leading up to Leviticus chapter 16. If the anointed priest sins, then and he brings guilt on the people, he is to present it to the Lord a young, unblemished bull as a sin offering for the sin he has committed, right? We also must understand later on, it will be understood that these are unintentional sins, okay? But now I want to stop here just to make sure we also connect the fact that this is a sin offering and he is to bring a bull, okay? Now, when you go back to Leviticus 16, verse 11, Aaron is to present the bull for his sin offering, okay? So that connects us back to Leviticus 4. Even though there may come a moment when the high priest is made aware of the fact that he has done something sinful and brought guilt on the people, and perhaps the Lord is bringing chastisement upon the people, then outside of the Day of Atonement, the high priest is supposed to and is required by Levitical code to bring this bull for the sake of his sin offering. And then with that, he is going to, of course, lay his hand on the bull's head, slaughter it before the Lord. He will take some of the bull's blood and bring it into the tent of meeting, which, if you think about it, on the Day of Atonement, this is exactly what he's supposed to do, right? When you read further in Leviticus 16, between verse 11 and verses 15 and on, you'll see that's exactly how he is supposed to handle this blood and manipulate it after it's been collected from the animal. Goes on in Leviticus 4 to say the priest is to dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of it 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain of the sanctuary. So understandably, this is actually the first curtain that separates the courtyard from the holy place, not the most holy place, okay? That's how I've come to understand it. He is not, of course, allowed to go inside the most holy place. It's possible, I suppose, that sanctuary here is meant to be limited only to the actual most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant is, but most biblical commentators seem to agree on the idea that the sanctuary itself is actually just the holy place and most holy place, not the actual courtyard itself. So he's not standing outside the actual curtain that separates the camp from the tabernacle itself. And the reason I say that is because if you go on through the rest of Leviticus 4, and this is the beginning of the chapter, so all of the rest of these sacrifices are somewhat diminished in value because they're lesser animals, not as expensive as a bull. And of course, that comes because of the station of the high priest and his closeness in proximity, a virtue of his ordination to the Lord and the Lord's holiness. So this would be an actual step outside the tabernacle if he is supposed to slaughter the animal on the burnt altar, or I should say the altar of burnt offering, and then go back outside the tabernacle. Rather, he advances to the next curtain, which separates the courtyard from the actual holy place, okay? Because other sacrifices are going to see blood go even further inside the tabernacle, which wouldn't make much sense if the rest of these sacrifices are diminishing in value and diminishing as goes the station of the person or people offering it. Anyway, the priest is to apply some of the blood to the horns of the altar of fragrant incense, which substantiates all the more the idea that this is the curtain that separates the actual courtyard from the holy place that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. and he must pour out the rest of the bull's blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering that is at the entrance to the tent of meeting, which would mean him coming back out to then dispose of the rest of the blood there. So I read this to you to help you understand the context for why the Day of Atonement is happening, and of course the nature of the sin offering itself, as originally defined first in Leviticus 4, then is transposed over Leviticus 16 to better appreciate why Aaron is first offering sin offerings for himself. He's offering a bull because he is the high priest, and so this first must be for his unintentional sins, so that thereby he is cleansed to go before the Lord inside the most holy place. Okay, so now that we've understood that, the next subheading, blood of the slain, that being the slain goat, is taken into the most holy place, while the goat for Azazel is sent away. So further into Leviticus 16, when he, the high priest, slaughters the male goat for the people's sin offering. Now notice this is the one that's slaughtered, so its blood is being spilled. And he brings it inside the curtain. That means he goes beyond the innermost curtain. He will do the same with its blood as he did with the bull's blood. He is to sprinkle it against the mercy seat, that is the lid that covers the Ark of the Covenant, and he will sprinkle it in front of it on the ground. He will make atonement for the most holy place in this way because of their sins, not make atonement for their sins. Notice it does not say that. It does not say make atonement for their sins. It says make atonement for the most holy place because of all of their sins, because of the Israelites' impurities and rebellious acts. He will do the same for the tent of meeting that remains among them because it is surrounded by their impurities. So he has to sprinkle blood also on the tent of meeting. And the tent of meeting is supposed to be understood as the actual sanctuary space of holy and most holy places, okay? Because that's where the Lord meets with them. The Lord does not come into the courtyard to meet with them. Now, before I read down here in Leviticus 16, verses 20 through 22, let me bridge for a second over to Leviticus 4. Now, if any of the common people sins unintentionally by violating one of the Lord's commands and does what is prohibited and incurs guilt, or if someone informs him about the sin he has committed because it's a sin of unwittingness, then he is to bring an unblemished female goat. Now, notice in the Day of Atonement, it's flipped. It actually is a male goat that's meant to be brought, okay? As his sin offering for the sin that he has committed, he is to lay his hand on the head of the sin offering, slaughter it at the place of burnt offering. Then the priest is to take some of its blood with his finger and apply it to the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. So it does not go beyond that point. Instead, it remains there. And then the priest has to eat the remainder of the sin offering. The sin offering offered for himself, that meaning of being a bull, is not meant to be eaten, but all the rest of the sin offerings are actually meant to be consumed by the priests, which really raises questions here with respect to the idea of the animal being slain and it being an animal slain for sins of high-handedness and the priest consuming this if it's been defiled by a person's sins. And the idea here is in Leviticus 4, it's actually a little bit different than Leviticus 16. One thing that's not said in Leviticus 4 is that the person who is laying their hand on the head of the animal is confessing any sin. This is only introduced to us in Leviticus 16. And again, I would encourage you and caution you not to read back into Leviticus 16, or I should say read back into Leviticus 4 what's present in Leviticus 16. And the reason why I say that is because there's already a bit of a precedent that is changed here with respect to the idea if a common person sins, or when we go to a leader of the people. In any one of these instances, beyond the priests offering for sin offering at the beginning of Leviticus 4, none of those match up correspondingly with male goats that are being offered here in Leviticus 16 for all the people, because the male goats are meant to be seen as the sin offerings for the people. Instead, it's a female goat that's offered in the place of the individual. And then if you go back and read Leviticus chapter 4, which actually I'm going to do here, I just want to ensure that I'm not speaking erroneously. In verse 13, it says, if the whole community of Israel errs and the matter escapes the notice of the assembly, so that they violate any of the Lord's commands and incur guilt by doing what is inhibited. And the assembly must bring a young bull as a sin offering. So notice that. As goes the concept of the Day of Atonement, really being a way of sort of cleansing the entire nation of sins, as goes unintentional sins. Then if we go back to Leviticus chapter 4, if the whole community has incurred guilt, they have to bring a young bull. But only one young bull is actually being slain on the Day of Atonement, and that's for the high priest. So we also have another precedent here in which instead of it being a young bull, it's a male goat. And instead of it being a female goat for the individual, if we're looking at the basis of the individual, from Leviticus 4 into 16, it's changed for a male goat. And there's no real way to substantiate those changes or explain them. And so by virtue of the fact that there are things that are changing, then we should not see what's being elevated here in Leviticus 16 as the high priest laying both hands, because notice this in Leviticus 4, it's a single hand. Both hands are being pressed down on the head of the animal in Leviticus 16. And for the first time, we have mention of the high priest confessing over the animal the sins of the people. That's not seen anywhere else. So that too is something that's new and introduced to us for the first time. And we should not then read it back into those preceding chapters. All that to simply say, what we're seeing here in the Day of Atonement is a means by which to cleanse the land and the most holy place from the unintentional sins of the people. And as we proceeded this lesson with last week's lesson, Jesus's offering, his sacrifice is far superior. It was necessary for him to come and do what he did, because without it, all those sins were still held in abeyance. There was not an efficacious way of removing those sins, even with these prescribed remedies. It was only enough to cleanse the land and the holy place, to continue the Lord's relationship with the people and make it welcome for him to stay, showing that they were indeed willingly coming to him and asking forgiveness for their sins, but only those sins that were unwitting and unintentional, not those sins of high-handedness that were normally met with capital punishments. That being said, let's go to Leviticus 16 and finish this out just a bit more. And I know you may be asking, okay, I'm waiting for the rest of the story here. How does this actually fit into what's going on with Jesus' crucifixion? I'll get there momentarily. So in verse 20 of chapter 16, when the high priest is finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he is to present the live male goat. Aaron will lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the Israelites' iniquities and rebellious actions. All their sins, he is to put them on the goat's head, send it away to the wilderness by the man appointed for the task. The goat will carry all their iniquities to a desolate land, and the man will release it there. So ultimately, the nuts and bolts of this: high priest, two goats, lot cast. Lot makes the decision on which one's for the Lord and which one is for Azazel. The one for the Lord is the one that's sacrificed, and it's done so first, so that its blood can be brought into the holy place, and by virtue of that, the most holy place, to make atonement for the tabernacle, okay, namely the most holy place and the holy place, sprinkling it before the Ark of the Covenant and on the Ark of the Covenant, and then the rest of the pieces of furniture, perhaps, and the walls of the most holy place. And after atonement is made there, then the high priest places both hands on top of the goat for Azazel, confesses sin, sends that goat away by the hands of another man to make sure the goat doesn't come wandering back into the camp. So it's important that we see that that goat goes far outside the camp. Now, we bridge this over to the gospel story. So with this, of course, I'm going to willfully ignore some of the details of what we've already had read here with respect to the council delivering Jesus up and the rationale behind all of that. Certain key statements that are being made with respect to that, as goes Jesus making the claim that he, or the people, namely those who he is being accused by, will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven, and all that that means. There will be perhaps a future time for us to discuss that and its eschatological significance. With that, instead, what I'm going to drill down here is what's going on once Jesus is brought before Pilate. So in the opening verses of chapter 23, we see that the whole assembly has rose up and brought him before Pilate. Notice this. If we're cheating a little bit here, we know what the outcome of this actual transaction is going to be, and that Jesus is going to be delivered up to be crucified. by virtue of that, seeing him as the Lamb of God, or at least in a slightly more basic sense, a sacrifice whose blood is going to be shed. Then we have people delivering up the, let's just say, quote, animal, sacrificial animal, sin bearer for the sake of sacrifice, right? End quote. And there has to be some mechanism like that in the Day of Atonement. You know, the question is asked, but certainly never answered by the text, and would only be from Jewish tradition that may actually give us some measure of truth in it. Where do the goats come from? Somebody's got to be the one that supplies those goats. You know, there's nothing said in Scripture with respect to the idea that there are separate flocks and herds that are meant to be kept aside, and those animals will be the stockpile they pull from for the daily burnt offering of the year-old male lamb at dawn and at dusk and so forth. Somebody's got to supply these things. The same, as I said, for the Day of Atonement, scapegoat and sacrificial goat as well. So anyway, the people are, as on the Day of Atonement, delivering up an animal. Here they're delivering up the sacrificial victim. They began to accuse him. So notice here, they are laying guilt upon this particular sacrificial animal or sacrificial offering that they're bringing. And they say, we found this man misleading our nation, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar, and saying he himself is the Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered, you say. And Pilate told the chief priests and the crowds. Yet he is, now it's so ironic here, the concept that it's Jesus' own people who should be lauding him as the innocent one. Instead, they are lauding him as the guilty one. And it's the pagan Gentile that's actually exclaiming Jesus' innocence. And Luke is so astute and keen to make sure we understand that he does so 3 times. With that, he says, I find no grounds for charging this man. So we come to understand that just as much as the goat that becomes the one whose blood is spilled for the sake of atoning for the sins and impurities of the people that has defiled the holy places where the Lord dwells, and the high priest must take that blood through its manipulation into that precinct to then cleanse it so the Lord would remain with his people. that goat has to, of course, be innocent, spotless, if you will. It's got to meet that stringent criteria of being virtually perfect. And so we have that dichotomization here. The people that deliver Jesus up, saying he's guilty, and of course he is going to take that guilt. He will willfully assume that guilt upon himself. While on the other hand, Pilate, the one who was receiving this sacrificial animal, is recognizing, just as much as the high priest who will take the goat from whoever the official custodian of those goats would be on the day of Yom Kippur, no doubt there's going to have to be a moment of inspection to say, yes, these goats meet the actual criteria, so that whichever one the lot falls on that's going to be the sacrificial victim, that indeed the Lord will find that one acceptable. Pilate is the one who receives that animal, in this case, Jesus, saying, yes, indeed. But of course, he's not saying, I accept the charge and I as well find him guilty. But he is inspecting him, saying he indeed is innocent. He indeed is spotless. In Pilate's own words, he says, I find no grounds for charging this man. But they kept insisting. He stirs up the people, teaching around all Judea from Galilee, where he started even to hear. Now, notice this subtitle here. You may be a little curious as to why exactly I have Jesus Barabbas, or Yeshua Barabbas, son of the Father. Now, I don't want to be dogmatic. You may already know this, and if that's the case, then just bear with me, but I'm sure there may be some listening to this who do not. There are some older English translations and more modern English translations that preserve a manuscript tradition that actually preserves the name of Yeshua with Barabbas, principally in the Gospel of Matthew. And of course, if it is supposed to be there, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. If it's supposed to be there, then it's not surprising it would be Matthew who would actually draw this out, his gospel being the most Jewish-laden gospel that there is. And of course, with this Day of Atonement theme being perhaps symbolized just a bit more by Matthew's particular choice to use Barabbas, or as we call him, Barabbas's true name, and that being Jesus. But I say this is a manuscript tradition, and what I mean by that is not all lines of manuscripts of Matthew actually preserve this name. And so oftentimes it's left there as just a footnote in our Bibles to make sure that we understand there is a manuscript tradition that does preserve that. By virtue of that, we should understand it's possible that it could be part of the original text of Matthew, but because we do not have that gospel, we do not know. As much as we don't have any part of the New Testament in its original context. But I digress. We can certainly reconstruct the original autographs from what we have today in the various manuscript traditions and the fact of the careful note-taking over the last 2,000 years as to these aberrancies that exist in various manuscript traditions. Having understood that, when we see other English translations and flip between all four Gospels where we see Barabbas's name being mentioned in this choice that is to be made by both Pilate and the people, who will be the one crucified, who will be the one released, almost all of them will only use Barabbas. So if his name actually isn't Yeshua, it doesn't matter, because what we do know from all the rest of the Gospels is that clearly, without equivocation, his name is Barabbas, which means son of the Father. And so if his name is son of the Father, while Jesus itself does not mean son of the Father, it means God saves, or God is salvation. What we do clearly know is that Jesus is stationed, by virtue of the question that's asked in all the Gospels that record it, by the high priest directly to Jesus. Tell us under oath, are you the Son of God? Is God your Father? Are you the Son of the Father? Are you Barabbas? So by virtue of that, we have two men standing openly before the people who are either in name, Barabbas, Son of the Father, or by virtue of title, station, and acclamation of many people, the Son of the Father, by acclamation of his own testimony, Son of the Father. So essentially what we have here is, before Pilate and the people, two sacrificial offerings. One potentially will be the actual sacrificial victim, whereas the other one, if we're fulfilling the type of the Day of Atonement, has to be the one that is let go, has to be the one that assumes the guilt, and by virtue of that, carries it away. Clearly what we have, by admission of the people and Pilate, is that indeed Barabbas is guilty. We're told this unanimously in all the Gospels, right? Luke 23, 18 through 19, they called out together, take this man away, release Barabbas to us. And parenthetically, Luke tells us that he had been thrown into prison for a rebellion that had taken place in the city and for murder. So presumably, he is indeed a guilty party. So as Barabbas leaves the crowd, because that's exactly what's going to happen, when the cuffs are taken off, when he is granted his freedom and told to go from that place, what we're supposed to see here symbolically is the idea that Barabbas, the guilty one, is actually leaving and going off to, as it would fulfill the type of the Day of Atonement, an uninhabitable place. But now the one thing we don't want to confuse, and of course, analogies are always meant after strain to a certain point to begin to break down. Barabbas is not the one who is actually bearing the sins of the people away. And this is part of the reason, perhaps, why we're to understand that his name truly is Barabbas. But it creates all the more of a point to bear out with respect to the connection to the name Son of the Father. Because if he is Son of the Father, then what we should also understand and appreciate about Jesus being the Son of the Father is that once Barabbas leaves the sketch, then Jesus, who was left as the Son of the Father, truly does assume the mantle of being the guilt bearer. We'll get to that momentarily. I want to go a little further in Luke 23. So Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and he said, you brought me this man as one who misleads the people. But in fact, after examining in your presence, I find no grounds to charge this man with those things that you accuse him of. And neither is Herod, because he sent him back to us. Clearly, he has done nothing to deserve death. It's almost as if Luke is straining the point here to say over and over again that Jesus is indeed the righteous, innocent one. They are trying to laud their own projected sins on top of him. After all, they accuse him of trying to stir up strife with Rome. But who's really the guilty party with stirring up strife with Rome? Obviously, it's been the Jews in more ways than one. Sure, you have the Sicarii, the assassins with their clandestine missions to try to strike out against Rome by killing not only Romans, but actually those Jews who sympathize with Romans. If there are prominent, rich, wealthy Jews who have gotten their wealth primarily through their sympathy with Rome and to Rome, and by virtue of their partnership with them, they didn't have a problem assassinating their own people, at least according to the records that's been left about them by writers from around the first century era, namely Josephus. And of course, you've got the Zealots, a part of the group from which the Sicarii come from, and they didn't mind inciting mob violence with respect to creating riots. And certainly, if you read the historical annals of what was going on in the centuries from the time Rome took over, or I should say the decades, because Rome really didn't establish their presence until 63 BC, when Pompey was asked to come and actually quell the rebellion and the infighting going on between the two factions of the Maccabee family. And then with that, Rome subsumed power and then eventually erected Herod as their puppet king. But from that point on, there was insistent rebellion, or I should say incessant rebellion, against first the Herodian dynasty. And then once his kingdom was fractured after Herod the Great died and he willed it to his sons, a part of it was given over to a Roman prefect to then rule as an actual Roman juris or a Roman province. And so with that, all the more rebellion stirred up, part of it because of the inciting of Rome trying to stir these people up, but also them trying to do what they could to undermine the Romans. And every class was guilty of this to some extent, whether you're talking the Pharisees, Sadducees, anybody, all right? So they are projecting their sins of stirring up strife with Rome and not being a friend to Caesar onto Jesus when they are the ones themselves that are actually guilty of it. Now, what we see is that Jesus is consigned to being, and then I say here specifically, Yeshua of Nazareth becomes the kata offering for Yahweh. According to the type, he's the one by which the lot has been cast, and he is the one who has been chosen to be the one whose blood will be spilled, and he will provide atonement for the holy place where the Lord dwells. And it's not ironic here that when you actually see the gospel accounts carrying out the rest of the story, at the moment when Jesus is hanging on the cross, there comes this succinct period where we do see interaction within the temple. Not Jesus going into the temple with his own blood per se, but we see a shredding, a tearing apart of that very heavy duty curtain that was meant to separate the holy place from the most holy place, right? So by virtue of that, as the writer of Hebrews will take up later on, the concept strikes true as that historical event happened, that the way has now been opened. And it's done so by virtue of the fact that Jesus and his body, through its breaking and the shedding of his blood, has paved that path for us. But there is a more transcendent idea, which we'll get to at the end of this lesson with what the writer of Hebrews also picks up on. But anyway, wanting to release Jesus, Pilate addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What has this man done wrong? I found no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him whipped and release him." But they kept up the pressure, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And their voices won out. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. Jesus will die. And just a few verses, or the next verse, so Jesus was handed over to their will. Whereas in verse 25, it opens up with, and they released the one that they were asking for. So Yeshua Barabbas becomes the offering for Azazel in the moment of the people's choosing. So again, you have the two Yeshuas, or the two sons of the Father, there before the people. They make clear by casting their lot who they want killed, and that's the righteous, innocent one who they are projecting their sins on. But at the same time, they want the actual guilty criminal who bears out their same guilt before Pilate, because as much as many of them were guilty in some way of undermining Rome, and yet this man went much further in inciting rebellion and actually was guilty of murder. It doesn't say of whom. We could presume Romans, but it could also have been of Jews, or both. Either way, the fact is he is guilty, and now the lot has been cast for him also. He will be the one sent away, and he will be the one who, in a sense, does bear their guilt. But of course, as was the case with the Day of Atonement, the live goat who bears the actual guilt away, we see the sins leaving the camp. But by virtue of that, the sins still remain on the animal. The animal is still bearing the guilt, if you will. And there was also the concern of what happens if this animal comes wandering back into the camp. There are some records that seem to preserve the idea that either there was a desire to, or there was actually execution of, pushing the goat off a cliff to make sure that not only does the goat die, but of course to ensure the goat never can come back into the camp, and by virtue of that, bring their sins back with it, right? So anyway, at this moment, we see the two Yeshuas, the two sons of the Father, going their separate ways. One deeper into the actual fortress where he's going to be scourged and then handed over to be crucified, and the other sent away. But this is where things start to actually flip. The paradigm telescopes on top of itself. So surprisingly, Yeshua of Nazareth then takes on the role of both the goat for Yahweh, which his lot has been cast for, and the goat for Azazel, once Yeshua Barabbas' part is accomplished, once he leaves, right? Because we read a little further down. Now we have two other criminals. They're also led away to be executed with him. So to say led away means now they're actually leaving the city of Jerusalem. So now Jesus has been numbered with the guilty criminals. Again, the goat for Azazel is the one bearing the guilt of the people and is being sent out of the camp to a faraway, desolate place, never to be seen again. Jesus also is going outside the camp, if you will, to then be crucified. And when they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. And I don't have time to go into the further significance behind all of that per se, but let's transpose this, if we will, back on top of Leviticus 16. So when Aaron slaughters the male goat for the people's sin offering and brings its blood inside the curtain, he has to put them on the, that's what he's to do with the blood of the offering. He's to bring it inside the curtain. And he is to then put them on, them being the sins of the people, the goat's head, and send it away to the wilderness by the man appointed for the task. So see that, if you will. Jesus begins to shed blood inside the city, not too far from the temple, because Fortress Antonia is actually a part of the Temple Mount. Or so that's what historical records seem to suggest very strongly. And so with that, the symbolism is there with respect to the sacrificial goat being slaughtered at the altar of burnt offering. And that, again, is where Jesus' bleeding begins, as goes within the city, very close to the temple construct. Then the other live goat is to be carried outside the camp and led away to never be seen again. Jesus is carried away, led outside the city, led outside the camp, to then continue or complete his suffering and there die. So in it all, Jesus becomes both as Son of the Father. He is the one that will take on the role of the goat for Yahweh and the goat for Azazel. And I think we see this very clearly with the writing of the writer of Hebrews, where he says in chapter 9, Christ has appeared as high priest. Notice this, who is the one who is to officiate over all that happens on the Day of Atonement? Obviously Aaron, or only the high priest can. High priest of good things that have come, and the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. He entered the most holy place once for all time. Clearly, whoever is writing this tractate in Hebrews is firmly familiar with what the actual writing of Leviticus says, and the understanding that the high priest can only go into the most holy place once a year. But here he's saying that Jesus, as this high priest after the order of Melchizedek, is the person who has went into the most holy place of the temple above, from which the plans for the tabernacle and then eventually the temple below is patterned after. He went there once for all time, not by the blood of goats and calves. So with that, we're to understand perhaps bull, and of course bull is mentioned here, and that being for the actual sin offering of the high priest, and of course the goats that are meant for the people, but by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a young cow, sprinkling those who are defiled, sanctify for the purification of the flesh, after all, that's what this is meant to do, is purify the holy place and the camp. And then, of course, he goes a little further. We talked about that last week with the ashes of the cow. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse our consciousness from dead works so that we can serve the living God? And then later on in chapter 13, he says, for the body of those animals whose blood is brought into the most holy place. And of course, we understand that signifies what he's already said over here with respect to the blood of bulls and goats, because only the blood of bulls and goats is what's brought in on the Day of Atonement. By the high priest as a sin offering, we understand it's the bull for his own sin, and then, of course, the goat for the sin offering, or as a sin offering for the people, and then are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also suffered outside the camp so that he might sanctify the people by his own blood. So clearly the writer of Hebrews understands that what happened when Jesus' passion was complete was the Day of Atonement's type had been satisfied. And so with that, what do we do? What do we do with that? I think we have to stop and think about how this is a bit more grand in scope than just the idea of Jesus's vicarious sacrificial atonement on our behalf is meant to cleanse us of our sins. Yes, at the level of the individual, that does indeed happen. But we should also understand that with the Day of Atonement as a type in and of itself, there is another component here that we're supposed to appreciate. Because while one animal was meant to cleanse the camp where the people live, the other animal was actually meant to cleanse the most holy space. The animal that left the camp is the one who makes atonement for the people as he carries their sins away, whereas the other animal makes atonement for the most holy place. But both of these work in tandem with each other to effect the same end simultaneously, right? And that is purification. So where is the temple piece? Where is the tabernacle piece? Where is the holy place and most holy place augmented in what Jesus is doing in his Passion Week? Well, the writer of Hebrews makes it very clear. But from a larger biblical meta-narrative perspective, we're to understand the temple that is cleansed and made fit for the Lord's habitation is the temple that is built upon the foundation of Jesus Christ, him as the chief cornerstone, and that is his body, the church. Nothing and no one else. Okay? And again, this really strikes hard at the base of any foundational argument that's to be made of another temple that is supposed to be built at the end of time. I digress. I don't want to get into that. All I would simply say is that Jesus has indeed atoned for and cleansed the holy space for God's habitation to be taken up amongst his people. And I think we see this very clearly in the writing of Peter, who has said that we are living stones fit together to become the habitation for the Holy Spirit, who is no less than God. And as God, he dwells within this building that is made out of living stones, as is referenced in so many other ways in the writing of the New Testament. So with that being said, we see the Day of Atonement has achieved both purposes through Christ's passion, right? He has cleansed a people, and those people are also meant to be the living stones by which the temple itself will be built upon. So the question then goes back to what the writer of Hebrews says: how will we then live unto God by virtue of that? And that is where I leave you to contemplate this in prayer. Thank you for listening. Lord Jesus, I pray that you will help us to make better sense of this so that we can allow it to transform our hearts, that we can understand with more purpose in the principle of how we are indeed this temple and how we are meant to live in this priestly manner, representing you before the world. We ask it in your name and to your glory. Amen. Thanks for listening.